Just so that you understand, I guess, and have a bit of background on what this particular event is. This is something we started several years ago, and this last lecture is meant to mark the last week in the regular academic term, if you like, in the regular academic year. We know we have things going on all year, but this is the idea, the last week of lectures. And what we do is we ask students in particular to identify who they consider to be outstanding lecturers. And a list comes forward, so the Student Association, very grateful to the Student Association for organising that, a list comes forward. And then we have some discussions and we have a think about both the directions provided by that list and about where previous last lecturers have come from and so on and so forth. But the few people that are nominated, and always, every year, it's only a relatively few people are nominated, are all absolutely outstanding, and this year is no exception. So it is my great pleasure to be here to acknowledge our 2017 last lecturer, Professor Geoff Dobson. And Geoff, as you are well aware from, or else you wouldn't be here, I suppose, is going to be speaking about his and his colleagues' very important work through this lecture, which is entitled Haemorrhage and Trauma Care in the Tropics, Applying the Lessons from War. This, I'm sure, will be a highly engaging lecture. There will be an opportunity at the end for questions. I did neglect, however, at the very beginning of my remarks to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today and on which our university is present. Of course, there are many traditional owners across all of those sites. Here in Townsville, that is the Wulgurukaba and Bindal peoples, the Jabberkai and Irukandji peoples in Cairns, and of course across the board we have a range of different Indigenous peoples whom we like to acknowledge. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm welcome to our 2017 last lecturer, Professor Geoffrey Dobson.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Sandra, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work, Hayley Letson and I. There's a group of two doing this work, and we're very proud of it. So what I'm going to talk about is innovations from nature to medicine, which is a theme running through the JCU's their interests. And the first, the outline of the talk is going to be, I'm going to be talking about the ALM idea. It's about buying time, applications to trauma, translation to the large animal, non-compressible bleeding and traumatic brain injury, and our most recent progression into human trials next year. The ALM is three drugs. Adenosine is produced by every cell in the body when it's under stress. Lidocaine is a local anaesthetic, which you all have heard about. Magnesium is well known, and that's all involved with energy metabolism and many other facets in the cell. After I lecture a series complete, I always get the students and I give them a little bit of advice. And whether that advice is to think big, find something that interests you, find a passion, find the best person in the world who follows your interests and you follow theirs, write to them, and if they don't respond, you may not want to work with them, but if they do respond, it could change your life. And this is how it changed my life. I started at Monash University at the bottom of this slide. I did a Masters in Zoology on oxygen transport. I then wrote a couple of letters, and I had 3 opportunities to go to Denmark, British Columbia, or the USA, Austin, Texas. I chose British Columbia because I heard the geography was pretty good and the skiing was just about an hour away. But the zoology department there was one of the best in the world. And then I left there and I went to the USA as a Fogarty Fellow at the National Institute of Health. Another letter got me in that position. And then I was a senior visiting fellow there for a number of years, and then I came to James Cook University, where I've been ever since. So today I'm going to be talking about our work with the US military and on trauma care in far forward environments. They're environments that usually they're expeditionary, they're dropped off with their canines or a small group. And those areas are obviously hostile, potentially hostile, and they share a number of parallels or similarities to these rural, remote and tropical environments that we find ourselves up here in the north. When someone gets injured, you've got a long distance from a medical treatment facility. It's resource limited. There's a delay to definitive care. And really in both situations, time is the killer. You don't have the hostility as you have in the far forward military environments, but these are nonetheless extremely important medical gaps that need to be filled. So some of the tactical combat casualty care translational advantages that have occurred have been through hemostatic bandages. These are bandages to stop blood loss. These bandages have little powder of shrimp, ground up shrimp cells, and that as soon as that hits blood, it immediately clots, and they put them on as a pack or a sponge. The tourniquet is, I've got one here, a military tourniquet, and that you just put the arm or the leg, and then you wind it up and tighten that to stop the bleeding. In the Vietnam War, they believed those were dangerous and harmful to the soldiers, and they caused many deaths. In the last two conflicts, these have saved thousands of lives. In fact, it's a modification of this. The Israeli army, and I think many of the US, they have these within the suits themselves. So it's in the arms, in the legs, that they could do that personally if they had a major injury. The next advantage that is translated from the military to the civilian medicine is limited fluid resuscitation. Again, in the Vietnam War, they used to put 3 or 4 litres of fluid in these people that had hemorrhagic blood loss, and that caused more deaths than it saved. What happens is that when you put a lot of fluid in your patient, it causes lungs to fill up, and you get an acute respiratory distress syndrome. And we now, what the military is trying to do is use ultra small volumes to help the body help itself, not these large volumes. And we'll talk more about that. So that's a snapshot of where we're going in this talk. And now I'm going to be talking about how we got there. One of the things that I learnt in Canada, which was has shaped my philosophy on thinking about science, and I share that with all my students that I teach, is the August Crow principle, and that is for a large number of problems, there will be some animal of choice best suited to study it. In other words, for a particular problem in science, medicine, there is one animal best suited to study it. And what it does, it taps into hundreds of millions of years of evolution that in nature's own laboratory, so you can develop new therapeutics. It makes you think about the harshness of, for example, 0.1% of all animals that have ever lived over the last 3.5 billion years exist today. So it's a very harsh environment out there in that laboratory. And so these animals have adapted, and that's why I went to Vancouver. I wanted to learn more about that, animal adaptations. Then I arrived back in JCU, and I then combined both experiences that I did, that I learnt in Canada, the August Crow principle, and then when I went to the National Institutes of Health, I specialised in cardiac. So what's interesting is that it's hard to connect the dots forward, but you can connect them backwards in terms of how you progress to where you are today. So what I did, basically, I'm combining my experience that I learnt in Canada to now a cardiac surgery, and using the cardiac work I did at NIH. So I asked this question: could the human heart be pharmacologically manipulated to operate like the heart of a natural hibernating animal? these little hibernators, and I used to have many of these. Every house in Canada and even the States, they have a little hummingbird feeder, and they come around, and I used to always have the camera out and trying to hide inside behind the curtain to get a snapshot of it. And as soon as I clicked that click, it would go just take off. They've got a heart rate of 1,500 beats per minute, these things. They are about the size of my little finger. They're 2 grams, and they're really like a little bumblebee. And when the environment gets stressed, whether it's cold or food availability is low, they can go into this overnight hibernation called torpor. And in 1832, Alexander Wilson first wrote on the hummingbird torpor, "No motion of the lungs could be perceived, the eyes were shut, and when touched by the finger, the bird was cold and gave no signs of life or motion." They could decrease their metabolic rate by 98%. So wouldn't that be phenomenal if we could work out ways to decrease our metabolism by 98% and still tick away at that what we define as life. Hibernators in cardiac surgery, they use these high potassium to stop the heart to do their surgery. And I felt that was, well, I know it's unphysiological, so how would a hibernator do that? And so I thought about different ways we could approach that particular problem without high potassium. High potassium depolarizes the cell voltage. So it's like trying to start your car at 8 volts. It won't start. And so they give high potassium to the heart. It cannot kickstart, and it just stops. And then when they finish the surgery, they'll reanimate the heart by taking the potassium off. The hibernator's heart doesn't alter its resting membrane voltage. It doesn't constrict its coronary arteries because potassium is known to constrict coronary arteries. And it's very resistant to arrhythmias. And so my training has always been thinking about biological time, how we could extend biological time, how we could reduce damage from ischemia reperfusion injury. And so this is the little guy, and on the right-hand side is an electric potential of the heart, and I will just show you how the idea came about. Now, I've got a little pointer here so we can go through. The heart has a pacemaker at the top, that little blue dot. And what happens is that at each beat, the conduction goes down the centre and goes around the sides, and each area has a different voltage. So there is an amplitude and a duration, amplitude and a duration in this part, and as you go down the heart, you've got all these different amplitudes and all these different durations. This duration allows the heart to fill, so it can actually fill and pump. And you do 70 beats per minute, and each day it's 100,000 beats your heart will go. So at the age of 70, you would have done about 2.5 billion beats. I'm up to about 2 billion. So it's an interesting concept to think about the heart as a pump when you think about the work it has to do. So the idea was, if you just took one of these action potentials, as they call them, over to the right-hand side, and so if you drop that y-axis and you reduce this duration, you will flatline the heart conceptually. So I thought about what drugs I could do to do that. And sodium entry, I knew from teaching physiology how the heart works and muscle and brain. If you could drop that and using a local anaesthetic, and if you could have a drug to reduce the duration, and we know that potassium is involved with this repolarization shoulder, so it's coming back down to its resting, and then another one will start, and then another one, and you do 100,000 of those a day. So I chose lidocaine for dropping that y-axis, and the x-axis I chose adenosine because adenosine is known to open the potassium channels and forbid this duration from occurring at high doses. We added magnesium because magnesium gives a stability to these repolarization shoulders. And so when we put AL and M, I remember going home that day and speaking to my wives in the audience, and saying, gee, I think I can turn the heart on, off and on like a light bulb, you know. It's really quite interesting. And it's natural voltage. So we did all the voltage, and we published all that work. And what we had is that the world's first non-potassium cardioplegia, which is now used in the US and Italy, probably over 20, maybe 40, 50,000 patients have had it, and could be used for transplantation. So it's a normal kalimate, normal potassium polarized arrest, because you're not using high potassium to do that. Now, there is aspects of the non-arrest, which I'm going to be talking about our trauma work, not the cardioplegia, but the non-arrest for regional ischemia. We've published on that, trauma, graft protection, angioplasty. And I'll talk a little bit about other aspects of whole body arrest in a little while. But that's the invention. And interestingly enough, cardiac surgeons in the 1990s, they were very excited about potassium channel openers, and not adenosine, but others. And they did these clinical trials, and they thought they're going to remove potassium. But what they found is that when the heart reanimated after being arrested, they found these shoulders did not couple with the ECG, and you got a spluttering and reperfusion arrhythmias, and they gave the game away. What they forgot to do is reduce that upstroke and inhibit that. So we worked with the group cardiac surgeons in Verona, Italy. 2 prospective randomized trials were done on very high-risk patients, and then a lower risk of about 200 patients and 100 here. And what they found is both trials showed significantly improved cardiac function, lower troponins. Troponins are an injury index. Lower lactates. Lactate is a metabolic stress indicator. And 1 to 2 days less in hospital in these patient groups, which in this US translates to $10,000 a day. And these high-risk patient trial, they showed 50% reduction in the use of blood products. I'll come around to that. We don't fully understand that might have been because it's a stronger heart, but it could be because the ALM is doing something to the clotting and making it improved in these patients. So before, I thought you might be interested, I thought some military people might be here, and I'd throw this one in. Could we arrest the brain? We're working on that now at the moment with a group in San Antonio and at the Navy Institute, Navy NAMRU, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute. But the Navy surgeon we're working with was the person in 2011 that got to our 3 Australian soldiers that were killed in the southern Afghanistan in the Kandahar base during a parade by an Afghan National Army in October 29, 2011. And I spoke to him about that, and he said, look, the organs were absolutely fine. And I said, well, what do you need? And he said, I need 10 minutes, because he said they just bled out. So then we thought, I was working at that time on the cardioplegia at Emory University. And so the JCU has a CRADA, a cooperative research agreement, with this group in San Antonio at the Naval Medical Research Unit, and they're currently working on this whole body, whole brain arrest. So this is the idea of the brain arrest. I just wanted to, I talk with students about how we think about problems and trying to keep things simple. The simplicity of the cardioplegia was simply keeping the voltage at the normal voltage, but reducing the pumping aspect of the heart. So what you're doing is that there is still basal, the metabolism, there's a pilot light going on, but the heart is unable to pump. And this is really an interesting aspect of various tissues, not just the heart. The idea with the brain is that could we use the same idea of action potential arrest? Could we take out the signaling in the brain and leave it as a basal with a basal metabolism. No drug has done that. There's always risks, and it's probably, it could be too complex to do, but I like thinking about that in a simple way. But wouldn't that be incredible if we could make the brain like a Townsville grass seed? You know, you just add water. You know, because these grass seeds, they've got a metabolism. They've got a basal metabolism, and as soon as it rains, up she goes. So that's what we're working with in that with that group. Now, at Emory with Guyton's group out of in Atlanta, what we did after a full day's cardioplegia, and we did 5 animals, normothermic. These were pigs. These were open-chested, fully instrumented, and we were testing the cardioplegia. And the animal was anaesthetised, and so we thought before we euthanise them, could we inject a large volume and see if we could arrest the whole animal? And we did that, and we flatlined it. The ventilator was turned off for 10 minutes, and the surgeon was getting very irritable after 10 minutes because they always want to try and save things. And so he started poking the heart, and the heart started to have this huge roll. So we turned back everything on, and we got better function in the heart than we had when we started. What we don't know, and that's what we're doing with the US military, is we don't know the effect on the brain, and so that would take cognitive testing. Here, Hayley Letson and I, in rats, we've injected a small bolus. We've flatlined like we did the pig. After a few bouts of cardio acceleration, what's fascinating, we found very similar to the hibernating animal when it arouses after being asleep for a very long time, and I'll show you that data. So what we did, we arrested it, and after a certain period of time, you see these little blips, these cardio-exaltatory blips, and they space, and they just come back spontaneously. So you flatline the animal, and they come back spontaneously, and see that little blip, it comes with a little pressure pulse, and then another pressure pulse where the next blip is. So that is very like an arousal in a hibernator. And then after 30 minutes, we found that we got a very good, after 30 minutes, we found we got a very good ECG, very strong, and a very strong heart. Again, we don't know what the effect is on the brain with cognitive testing. So applications to trauma, and that's what the talk is about, but I have to give that to show where the ALM idea came from. So since the heart, I've been with many surgeons in many operating theatres and watching watching humans after a number of valves and four bypass of the arteries. Very complex surgery, and the surgeons say, look at that heart respond, look at it recover after a very, very traumatic period of surgery. And they use very little inotropes, and the beautiful thing is, at high dose, the heart's arrested, and all you do is just wind down the dose, and it just starts to beat at its natural rhythm, because the action potential of voltage is at its resting level. So they do this so they see very little post-operative arrhythmias. So the second idea was, could I use that low dose to reanimate the heart for trauma? So that's how that idea came about. So there's a huge unmet need in the tactical combat casualty care. There's no far forward therapy that works. Small volume hypertensive. Hypertensive means, and I'll talk a little bit about that, it's a lower pressure resuscitation for rescuing and stabilising the heart. And 87%, this is what we're addressing, 87% of all the battlefield deaths are from haemorrhage in the first 30 minutes. So the golden hour doesn't exist. We're working, Hayley and I are working in the platinum 10. So the military deaths over the last 2 conflicts, 4,596. The US military estimate that about potentially survivable deaths is a bit over 1,000. And the 90% of those are from bleeding. So that's what we're addressing and that's what the military have contracted JCU to do. Traumatic brain injury, 20 to 25% of battlefield injury. There's no successful treatment, and if you combine it with hemorrhage, it is highly lethal. And as you know, that the signature injury of both conflicts is what they call is a mild concussion, which has serious implications for trauma-related emotional states. So there's an unmet need in traumatic brain injury to reduce the secondary injury, and we'll talk about that too. So our training is all about achieving a more natural whole body homeostasis. Just like I was talking about, we want to achieve a natural voltage. We want to achieve a natural whole body homeostasis. We want to help the body help itself. We don't want to flood it with more fluids and shock the body a second time. So these fluids that were used in the Vietnam really are disturbingly bad for the patient. And even today in cardiac surgery, they will give 2 to 3 litres in a patient when they don't need it. Like you'd only give fluids if a patient was dehydrated. And they've done studies whereby abdominal surgery and the amount of fluid loss from evaporation and during the surgery, it's 0.5 mils per kilogram per hour. It is tiny. So they're filling these patients up, and what the testimony I have, it just shows you what you can give to the human and what they can tolerate, in my view. So the idea of fluid resuscitation is to, in a shock state, your blood pressure is down in the red zone, and that's because the heart is failing and it cannot sustain oxygen to the tissues of the body. So if you like those people in Kandahar, they bled out real quick, and they could not resuscitate them. So how do you bring up the blood pressure? The mean arterial blood pressure is a value. So everyone knows the 120/80, the systolic over diastolic. The mean arterial pressure is not halfway because the heart pumps in a different way, but it's called a mean arterial pressure, which is sort of midway, but you do it through a formula. So what you want to do is bring the mean arterial pressure to in the green zone, because you don't want to go up to your normal pressure. Your normal map is about 100. If you go up to there, you will pop the clot and you will die. So you need to bring the pressure up into a zone where the mean arterial pressure is what they call a hypotensive mode. And in that way, you can sustain oxygen to your tissues and buy time. So our first experiments were carried out by Haley in a rat model, and our target was to reduce and stabilise, target to rescue and stabilise the heart. We used 7.5% sodium chloride with the ALM. We had 7.5% chloride. It's twice the salinity of the sea. We used that because we thought down the track this might be good for trauma. And the salt stops the edema after a bang on the head, and so that was why we did that. And what we found is that it does give the whole system a little bit of initial kick, and it helps with the ALM do its job. So what we found is that in our model, we get our baseline data. What Haley does, she has a catheter and she slowly bleeds the animal out, so the blood pressure drops to 40 from a map of 100 to 40. So that's a shock state, and she does that for 20 minutes. And then the animal can't compensate then. It stays at 35 to 40 in a shock state, and then we leave it for another 60 minutes, and then we put our solutions in. And we won't go through all these, I'll just show you the ALM versus the control. But she takes out about 8 mil, and I've got a little show you that. So that's a little, the blue is 8 mils, that's what she takes out of a rat, and that's how much we put back. we put a tiny volume back into, so we put 8 drops back to resuscitate the animal. And that's just that in a picture. So what she found is that the salt, as you would predict, it increases and then it distributes throughout the body and then it goes back to its shock level. The ALM slowly increases. This is mean arterial pressure over a 60-minute resuscitation period with 8 drops, and up she goes, and it stays there at that particular pressure. So in order to understand the bleeding aspect, there's 2 ways. You can bleed from the vessel, from the wall rupture, from a gunshot, from a shrapnel. But you also bleed from the effect of trauma itself over time. So the blood thins and fails to clot, and that's called traumatic induced coagulopathy. So we had a coagulometer in our lab, and what it measures is the plasma part, the clear part of the blood, and all it measures is clotting time. And what you find in control at 17 seconds, that's the time it takes the blood to clot, the plasma to clot. At the end of the bleed, you see it increases a little, to 42. After that 60-minute shock, it goes way up, so the blood is getting very thinner, it's promoting bleeding. And then after 60 minutes, the untreated and the control, the sodium chloride itself, it's all cannot form a clot, but the ALM has now brought it back to its baseline. And we found that a very curious result. So then we were working with the Navy at the time, and they gave us a coagulometer, a ROTEM machine. And what a ROTEM does, it measures clotting properties in the whole blood, not the plasma, the whole blood, because clotting requires blood cells, platelets, etc. So what this machine does, and I'll just be very brief, what it does is there's the clotting time that we've measured in plasma. And then it forms a wider clot, and it's like a comet, and that's an amplitude. So it's the ability of that blood to form a clot, and then it prolongs the clot, and if it breaks down, that's not so good. If it keeps up, and that is good. And so what we found in this machine, that we'll just look at this top one. There's a nice clot in the baseline. Look at the 60 minutes resuscitation, cannot clot. And the ALM, we've now confirmed at 60 minutes, it makes a nice clot. Then the question is, how fast does it clot? When you put the ALM in there, how long does it take to restore the clotting properties of the blood? And we found and published this, that it happens in 5 minutes. You can see in 5 minutes the sodium chloride itself, it's taking a long time to clot, forms a clot and then just breaks down. And at 60 minutes it just gets worse. So what we've found is that the ALM in our model corrects the coagulopathy, which is a big deal. So now translation into a large animal, and Haley went over to Denmark to do that in the pig. And what we did in the pig, we bled the animal out, same as the rat, but she bled the animal out over a 90-minute period and kept the mean arterial pressure, the map down at a shock value for 90 minutes. And then she put in the ALM resuscitation. So I'm not sure what happened to that one. Oh yeah, it's happening. The baseline, 90-minute shock. Then she put a bolus in, hypertensive resuscitation. So we took out 2 litres and we only put in 140 mils back. Again, and then after 60 minutes, we put the blood back and we monitored it for a 3-hour period. So 2 litres was taken out and we put in 0.14 to 0.16 litres back. And what we found, I'll show a bit of data here, but the ALM raises that mean arterial pressure into that hypertensive zone. So normally it's 100 at rest, put it into a shock state, it goes to 40 for 90 minutes, then we resuscitate and see it comes up and the ALM stays at 50, and then the controls go back down below shock values. Now this is a significant difference, and then you put the blood back and away you go. So these are all very subtle changes. Then what we found is that ALM bolus after 60 minutes, it increased stroke volume by a factor of 2. So how does 140 ml, you've taken 2 litres out, how does 140 ml of a resuscitation fluid increase your stroke volume? Stroke volume, your cardiac output is the stroke volume times your heart rate. So your 70 beats per minute times the stroke volume. So the stroke volume is the amount of blood that's pumped per beat. And that's increased by a factor of 2. It looks like how that's working is what the ALM does, it lengthens the time for the heart to pump its blood out of its chamber. And so ALM increases the time to eject that blood, therefore it increases the time to have per beat a greater stroke volume. The ALM lowers the metabolic stress, that lactate significantly lowers that throughout that one little bolus. And interestingly, it actually significantly increased the urine output by 3 to 4-fold after that period of time. So the non-compressible bleeding. So we then worked with the US Special Operations, and we got onto our second contract with them, and the development of a new ultra-small volume resuscitation fluid for far forward, non-compressible. So what we've been doing in our model is we've been drawing blood out and keeping the pressure low. This time what we're going to do is open the chest and just cut 60% of the liver off and let the internal bleed out. And that's the problem with the military. Very difficult to put a tourniquet around a bleeding organ. You can't do it. So and we changed it to 3% sodium chloride because FDA has approved that, and it might facilitate rapid adoption into the field, because adenosine, lidocaine, magnesium is all FDA approved individually, but together it is a new drug. And this time we gave it a bolus, waited 60 minutes, and then we thought we'd try a drip, because what the military wanted was us to take these animals out to 72 hours. I'm only talking 4 hours here, but Hayley's just completed experiments where just last week where she takes them out to 72 hours after that bolus and that 4-hour drip, where the controls can't even make it to 24 hours. So it's a very, very exciting finding. And the reason for 72 was that the special ops were in, I think, part of Africa, and they got stuck and they couldn't get out, and they lost quite a few by virtue of delayed evacuation. So that 72 hours is a military number that they wanted us to study. And what Hayley found in this one, where she resected, cut 60% of the liver, 100% survival with the ALM group, with that bolus and the drip. And the drip is 0.5 to 1 mils per kilogram per hour. And we chose that value because that's the maximum amount of volume that a patient, loses in water and things. We wanted to try and keep ultra small volumes to make it medically significant. And so the internal bleeding, the ALM reduced internal bleeding by 60% after that 4 hours. So what we noticed, we didn't know that was going to happen, but what Hayley noticed is when she was doing her, after the surgery, looking at the abdominal cavity, she found that there was so much less blood in the abdomen. So then she started to quantitate that by weighing gauzes, and it was significant, 60% reduction in blood loss. And that looks like the ALM is reducing the blood loss after that cut with the bolus and the drip. Increased cardiac function, increased gut and kidney blood flow. That's a big one, because ischemia in the gut is really the one where you get your secondary complications, infections, and what we found with using a very fancy Doppler approach that the military brought us that increased gut and kidney blood flow. We decreased liver injury, believe it or not, even though we cut half of it off. Decreased systemic inflammation by 70%. This is a big deal too. And it corrected coagulopathy, as we said. Hextend, which is what's recommended in the far forward, killed 100% of them early. And yes, that's the 72-hour work. So ALM acted, internal bleeding, it acted like a pharmacological tourniquet. And we believe that could be used for military hemorrhage, rural and remote accidents, farm accidents, Las Vegas shootings, post-partum haemorrhage, and shark attacks. The next project that the SOCOM funded was now traumatic brain injury, because on the field it's very difficult to diagnose under conditions of hostility whether someone's got a brain injury or not. They know where they're bleeding, or internally it's a bit complicated. So with our same solution, what we're doing, we're addressing hemorrhage and TBI, it's the same dose and the same strategy. So this is traumatic brain injury just itself, and we gave it a moderate fluid percussion injury to the head. The ALM increased survival, 100% survived, 50% controls died. Decreased injury markers, decreased inflammation, again by 70%. It's really blunting this inflammation, and ALM corrected coagulopathy and prevented this neurogenic. What we found is that from a bang on the head, we found the right side of the heart really dilated. And we were interested in further studies on that, looking at people with TBI, particularly on the records, what the ECG says, of whether this, the literature says that this is an undiagnosed problem, that people are worrying about the head, and the heart could also be compromised. To give you an idea of this traumatic brain injury, we hear a lot about it. In traumatic brain injury, you've got the primary injury, and that's like throwing a pebble in a pond. You've got that initial impact. Then you've got the ripple effect, and the ripple effect, that's the secondary injury that occurs. That's the bleeding, that's the inflammation, that's the further injury. This is where the action is. You can't do much about this, but you can decrease the secondary injury, and there is no drug available to do that. This is a picture of the rat brain in the control versus there's the injury there, and this is after 4 hours with the ALM. It is a very interesting, curious fact that you've got reduced redness and an injury site where the ALM has acted. The brain injury markers, ALM drops those, as I said earlier, and it increases blood flow by a factor of 3, which is very interesting even at these low pressures. So you've hypertensively resuscitate them, but you're still getting blood flow to the head. And we think that's a very significant finding. This is the inflammation markers themselves in the brain. IL-1 beta is a very key inflammatory signal, TNF-alpha. And every cell, the immune cells have a protein platform in the cytosol called the inflammasome, that they believe that when you do see that signal transduction through an injury, this platform activates and it amplifies inflammation. And it's called the inflammasome, and we think that the ALM is reducing the activation of the inflammasome. So the ALM therapy for just TBI, the one-punch victims, sport head concussions, falls, car accidents, farm accidents, rural trauma, and pediatric trauma. So this is the end game. This is what we're trying to do with the US military, is a 3% sodium chloride little small bolus, and the drip that is for the long-term stabilisation up to 72 hours. But you only do this for 4 hours because it has this long-lasting effect. Also, you could use this drip for trauma of any major surgery, because trauma is part of surgery. It is part of an inflammatory response. So if you could reduce the inflammatory response, you might have a better patient outcome and less days in hospital. And we've already sent our recipe over for the military canines for the special ops. And these guys love their dogs. They jump out of the planes with them. They're usually the first ones that enter the hostile areas. And of course it has the rural and remote. So human trials, very quickly, Camden, New Jersey. It has one of the highest murder rates in the US. This is right opposite Philadelphia. It's a 10-minute cab ride, and have a population of 77,000 in half the size of Magnetic Island. 1,500 violent crimes, 50 homicides. I gave a grand rounds there last year, and 2 people died that night from during the time I was there. And this is where the Special Operation Forces train and their surgeons go. This Cooper University has 3,000 trauma patients per year. This is us on the top of where the helicopter lands. There's Philadelphia. You turn your head and that's Camden, New Jersey. And they have, when they hear a gunshot, it's military triangulation, and so they will find out where that shot comes from so the police can get there as quick as possible. It's not a great area to be in. And it's sad that it has to be so close. And so on that, what we like to do here at JCU is charter new horizons, innovate, navigate, communicate. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to Haley Letson's father. And he passed about 5 years ago from a brain injury, too young to do that. I'd also like to dedicate it to my wife's mother, who had a fall only 2 months ago and had a brain bleed. Haley's dad also passed from a brain bleed. And Haley and I think that a bolus of our can stop that, prevent that ripple effect, and perhaps lead to a better outcome. Would also like to thank Ian Wronski, Jeff Gordon, and Richard Murray for their support, and also JCU. And our goal next year is to get Haley a technician. Thank you very much.